This is NNI Bites Big Learnings, a podcast where fellow healthcare professionals converse about the latest on nutrition science. Join us as Andrew Prentice and Berthold Koletzko share their knowledge and insights on whether growth in early childhood is a window of opportunity for programming long-term health.
Welcome to our podcast NNI Bites Big Learnings. My name is Andrew Prentice. I'm Professor of International Nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Berthold Koletzko to the podcast. For many years now, Prof. Koletzko has been, in my mind, the leading pediatric expert in nutrition in Europe and indeed worldwide. He's reached this pinnacle through a combination of truly excellent research and also leadership in the field of policy. Perhaps best known through his books, Pediatric Nutrition in Practice and Nutritional Care of Preterm Infants, among many others, he has published well over 1,000 research papers, over 250 book chapters and 40 or so books and monographs. He's editor-in-chief of the Annals of Nutrition and Metabolism and of the World Review of Nutrition and Dietetics. And Bert, how you find the time to do this truly beats me. Through his participation in many systematic reviews of evidence and guideline committees, he has made major contributions to pediatric nutrition. Among numerous leadership positions, he's now the president of the European Academy of Pediatrics. Professor Koletzko was trained in pediatrics at the Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto, in Johannesburg, and the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center in Moshi, Tanzania, as well as the Hospital for Sick Kids in Toronto and his native Germany, and therefore brings a truly global perspective to the issue we're about to discuss. Professor Koletzko, it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this episode of NNI Bites.
Thank you, Andrew, for the very kind introduction.
So today we're discussing a paper by you and your colleagues on Is Growth in Early Childhood a Window of Opportunity for Programming Long-Term Health? And this appeared in a recent issue of Annales Nestlé. Now, many of our listeners are healthcare professionals who, through their contacts with families and children, can make a real difference to children's lives. Shortly, we'll focus on the infant growth aspect, but I'd like you to start, if you would, by giving listeners a very brief summary of the theory known as the developmental origins of health and disease, so-called DOHAD, which is largely focused on fetal growth rather than infant growth.
Sure. Well, it's not only fetal growth, it's a continuum, I believe. People talk about the first 1,000 days of life as an opportunity to shape and improve health and development of children lifelong. And in fact, it's the whole period from preconception through to pregnancy and early childhood where there is really an enormous opportunity, because this is a period when the very rapid growth and development of the organism is shaped, and it is influenced by environmental cues. We've known this for a long time. We've known that in pregnancy, for example, infections or toxic influences can change dramatically the trajectory of development of a child. And we've come to appreciate that also metabolic signals induced by nutrition play a key role in shaping the growth and development of the fetus and the child. For example, we know, if the mother has gestational diabetes that is not well controlled, the blood sugar is elevated in the mother and the fetus because glucose goes across the placenta without any limits, then there is fetal hyperinsulinemia, increased fetal body fat deposition, and that predisposes to later increased adiposity in childhood and adulthood and increased risk of obesity. And we have many more such examples where there is a marked effect of nutritional conditions during pregnancy and early childhood that shape the development of the child. Thus, the consequence for clinical practice is we should really invest in improving nutrition and lifestyle throughout the period from preconception, pregnancy, and childhood to improve the lives of people.
Thanks, Bert. And listeners may be interested to know that we've really only fully understood this in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, and it's really playing a much greater role in our thinking now. So your paper starts by summarizing the long-term effects of growth failure in young children and how this still impacts on the long-term life chances of hundreds of millions of children worldwide, especially in countries such as Gambia, where I work. This issue is clearly of huge importance, but we've covered it in recent podcasts. So I'm keen to devote today's conversation to the issue of excess weight, which, as you point out, is now increasingly common. So you've shown that early weight gain is a risk factor for overweight and obesity in later life. In particular, I wonder if you could talk our listeners through a paper you published in which you analysed the longitudinal growth patterns of children in 11, I think it was, high-income cohorts. What did you reveal here, Berta? And especially in relation to those children, you had a group that you described as persistent rapid growth. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, we all know in pediatric practice that growth is both an indicator and a predictor of health and health disturbances. And as you pointed out, for a long time, we've been focused on growth faltering as the key challenge that we should put our attention to. And clearly, it is a big challenge if children have marked growth faltering. But now we have a situation where around the world, we have many more children that are overweight compared to those that are underweight and stunted. And so we are really interested in looking at the early risk factors for lasting overweight, obesity, and related non-communicable diseases. And we've come to appreciate that an excessive weight gain, a weight gain where children cross the percentiles upward, is a strong predictor of a later risk of obesity and associated disease. And therefore, we've looked at the actual growth patterns of children in affluent countries around the world. We had an opportunity to look at longitudinal cohort study data in a large number of children. I think it was about 6,000 children that we included, if I remember correctly. And what we found, to our surprise, was that only about half of the children, 44%, had a growth trajectory that we would expect based on the growth standards of the WHO. In other words, they had a standard deviation score of their body mass index around 0 from birth to age 6 years. That was only less than half of the children. Almost the other half had a rapid early weight gain, particularly in the first 2 years of life. The BMI deviated upward from the median percentiles, and then it came down a little bit again in early childhood, but it stayed elevated at the time of 6 years. And in fact, when we followed up children up to adulthood, which was a subgroup of this cohort, up to the age of 20 years, we saw that those children who had a rapid weight gain upwards in the first 2 years of life also had an increased body mass index and an increased fat mass in adulthood. So this is really a marked risk for later overweight and obesity if we consider that this is almost half of the healthy population. So the take-home message for practice is we should not be relaxed if children have a consistent increase of body weight over and above normal percentiles in early childhood. Obviously, no child grows exactly on the percentile. If children have a little bit of fluctuation around percentiles, that's normal. But if children deviate upward for 1 percentile channel or more, we should probably look at this more closely, ask why is this, and what opportunities do we have to counsel families to try to correct this. And on a public health perspective, we really need to explore those risk factors that bring populations of children to have rapid excessive weight gain. Factors such as overfeeding or feeding the wrong kinds of foods with too much sugar, or one topic that we looked at, too much protein in early life.
We'll come on to that. Let's talk about breastfeeding. On these podcasts, we're always keen to emphasize that breastfeeding is nature's best way of feeding a baby, but you also found that breastfeeding influences these early growth patterns and indeed later disease risk. Please tell us a bit about that.
We know breastfeeding is the best way to feed a baby for many, many reasons. And if you look at growth, it's fascinating to see that breastfeeding reduces the risk both of slow weight gain and high weight gain. It's amazing. Slow weight gain, underweight, breastfeeding is protecting in the particularly in the early months, because breastfeeding reduces the risk of infection and inflammation. That's probably one important factor. And it also reduces the risk of high body weight at 1 year of age. We all know breastfed babies that are really around 3 to 4 months of age. In fact, if you compare growth centiles of breastfed and formula-fed populations, the breastfed populations tend to be heavier at 3 months, but then the curves cross again, and the breastfed babies get leaner during the second half of the first year of life, even if breastfeeding has been discontinued. And at 1 year, breastfed babies on average are certainly about 0.2 standard deviations less heavy than those that are formula fed. And that could be really a big protective effect on the long run.
Great. And you then, here's the really interesting bit that I want to get us into, which is that you then hypothesized that the healthier rates of weight gain in breastfed babies were due to the lower protein content in human milk compared to formulas. Please tell us, you then conducted an amazing large multi-center, multi-country RCT to test this. Tell us about that, Bert.
Yes, obviously there's 1,000 things that are different between breastfeeding and bottle feeding, not only the composition of the milk, but also the mode of feeding, the suckling behavior, the frequency of feeding, and all that. So it's very difficult to understand what could be all the factors that impact on different growth trajectories between populations and breast and formula-fed babies. But we felt one factor that is modifiable is the protein supply, which traditionally has been far higher with bottle feeding than with breastfeeding, because protein, we all knew, is essential. It's a good thing. The more, the better, people thought, perhaps. And of course, bottle feeding was based on cow's milk traditionally, and cow's milk has about 3 times the protein content than breast milk. So one came from cow's milk, diluted it a little bit, reduced the protein intake, but it was usually about 1.6, 1.8-fold more total nitrogen in bottle feeds in the past than in breast milk. And if you look at the true protein content, the difference was even bigger, because breastfeeding contains about 25% of non-protein nitrogen, which is much lower in formula feeding. So we felt, let's look at this, because there were some suggestions, some associations between protein intake and weight gain. Also, if you look across species, you see that across mammalian species, the protein content in milks is closely related to the speed of weight gain, the speed of doubling of weight gain from birth. So there is clearly a close relationship between protein and weight growth. Also, we had indications that protein, and particularly some components in the protein, would be relevant in stimulating the key growth factors in infancy, insulin and IGF-1. So based on these thoughts, we said, let's test this and do a randomized clinical trial where we randomized infants to formula with conventionally high or a reduced protein content more similar to human milk. And we made sure that the 2 interventions had formulas with the same energy density, which was compensated for by an adaptation of the fat content. And we also had a reference group of breastfed children. This was a large study, which included almost 1,700 healthy infants born at term. So it was a huge effort, and it cost a lot of money. We were lucky to get generous funding from the European Commission to make it happen. And the results were really much more impressive than we had expected, because not only did we find a market impact on the growth trajectories during the time of feeding in the first year when feeding was different, but it lasted after 2 years, 1 year after the end of the differences in feeding. There was still a significant difference in weight and body mass index, and it persisted until school age and adolescence. So at school age, when we adjusted for other confounding factors, the reduced protein supply with optimized formula in the first year reduced obesity risk 2.6-fold at school age and
Which
made
is
it
a huge effect.
it's a huge effect, and it's almost similar to the rate in breastfed babies. To 2.6-fold difference in obesity, we have not found in any other evaluated intervention program in children to reduce obesity risk. If you look at the Cochrane review on obesity prevention studies, you don't find any other studies that have such an effect size. And the good news is it's very easy to implement. Obviously, the first option is to do our best to promote and support breastfeeding as much as we can. But in those children that cannot be fully breastfed, then we can provide a formula with lower protein content than before, which is now available. Manufacturers have very rapidly reacted and have brought out optimized formula compositions with lower protein contents. So we can select a formula with a protein level more similar to breast milk and therefore easily protect children against this risk.
And if I'm not mistaken, it might be useful for listeners to know that really all modern formulae have much less protein than they used to be in the older ones. But as you say, there's also differences, and you can select a lower protein one.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's very encouraging to see that also the regulations have adapted. So in the European Commission, in the European legislation, for example, the limits for protein have been corrected downwards in the Codex Alimentarius standards of the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization. The same trend is followed. So it is both the manufacturers and the regulators that have reacted, which is great.
And this is a wonderful example of scientific method in nutritional research. You have an observation, you hypothesize what may cause it, you do an intervention, you then follow that up with a meta-analysis of other interventions. And then when you know that you're onto something, you've got the right answer, you push that through to policy. And I really admire the work you've done, Bert, in helping to get to the end point where, people have companies have changed the formulation, the administrating bodies, the regulatory bodies have changed their regulations and things. It's a fantastic piece of work. I would have loved to talk
but there's
to
still more to do. I just want to emphasize it's not only formula, because around the world, there's still a lot of animal milks given at an early age. Sometimes because of necessity, because it's not affordable or feasible to use an other alternative, and then that's the way it is. We have to accept if there's no other choice. But there's also a lot of animal milks, cow's milk, and others unmodified given to children where there is an alternative. And again, in cow's milk, for example, the protein content is 3 times as high as in human milk and modern formula. So it's important to spread the information, to spread the word to families, to the public, that cow's milk is for cows, but it's not for feeding babies.
Bert, thank you for walking us through this truly fascinating topic so clearly and helpfully with much advice for healthcare professionals. I'm going to end by summarizing your key messages, and these are in your words because I took them from the end of your paper. You told us that a rapid weight gain in infancy and in preschool years points to lasting and grave adverse health effects if we get it wrong. Consequently, you advise that monitoring of child growth in clinical care should pay close attention to upward deviation, in particular of weight centiles or Z-scores. So that's a change from the prior concentration on downward deviations. You shared the considerable evidence that breastfeeding is associated with a lower risk of childhood obesity and later life obesity. Professor Koletzko, it's been a true honor to have you share your really massive experience. And I hope we have another opportunity soon, maybe to widen the aperture and talk about some of your other work.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure indeed.
Thank you, Bert. And thank you, listeners, for listening to this edition of our podcast, NNI Bites Big Learnings. And may I please end by urging you to subscribe through the NNI 365 app to make sure that you don't miss our future offerings.
And that concludes today's episode. Thank you for joining us with Andrew Prentice and Berthold Koletzko as we talked about whether growth in early childhood is a window of opportunity for programming long-term health. We hope you enjoyed and learned from this quick discussion, fellow experts. Till the next episode.